For decades, Africa has been known as a continent that exports its wealth but imports its failure. Within the oil, we export the crude. Other country refines it, then we buy it back at a much higher price. It is a cycle that has lasted for generations. Many believed it could never change, but something remarkable has happened in Nigeria. Quietly, without many people around the world noticing, an African refinery has become one of the most important suppliers of jet fuel on earth. Aircraft flying across Europe, planes landing in North America, and airlines in different parts of Africa are increasingly using fuel refined in Nigeria. It is a moment that many Africans once thought was impossible. Yet, there's a strange contradiction. While the rest of the world celebrates Nigeria's industrial success, millions of Nigerians are still struggling with high petrol prices at home. So how can a country export fuel to the world while its own citizens continue to pay so much for petrol? Has Africa finally become free from an old economic system, or has the system simply changed its shape? Today, we'll follow the facts behind one of the biggest industrial stories Africa has seen in decades. Welcome to AfriArise, where we explore Africa beyond the headlines. Here, we don't just report events, we explain why they matter, from history to economics, from leadership to innovation. We tell the African story with facts, context, and perspective. If you're passionate about Africa's future, subscribe and join thousands of people discovering a different side of our continent. There was a time when very few people believed Africa would compete with the world's biggest industrial economies. Large refineries were expected to be found in places like the United States, Europe, Singapore, or the Middle East. Africa, many believed, would simply continue exporting raw materials forever. Then came the Dangote Refinery, located in Lekki, Lagos State. The refinery represents one of the largest private industrial investments in African history. The project took years to build. It cost billions of dollars. Many doubted it would ever become fully operational. Some even described it as an impossible dream. But eventually, the refinery reached commercial production. Then it continued expanding. As production increased, something unexpected happened. The global energy market suddenly needed an alternative supplier of aviation fuel. Conflict in the Middle East created uncertainty around one of the world's most important oil shipping routes. Airlines and fuel buyers began searching for reliable suppliers outside the region. Nigeria was ready because the refinery had already increased production capacity. It was able to respond quickly. Instead of watching an opportunity pass by, Nigeria became part of the solution. Exports of aviation fuel rose dramatically. Within a short period, the refinery moved from being a new player in the market to becoming one of the world's largest exporters of jet fuel. For Africa, this was more than just another business success. It was a proof that the continent could process its own resources and compete internationally. For decades, African countries have sold raw materials while importing finished products. This refinery challenged that pattern. For once, more value was being created on African soil, and the world noticed. To understand why this refinery matters, we first need to understand how the global oil business has worked for decades. Imagine a farmer who grows cocoa. Instead of making chocolate, he sends the cocoa beans for a small amount of money. Another country buys those beans, turns them into chocolate, packages them beautifully, and sells them back at several times the price. Who makes the biggest profits? Not the farmer, but the manufacturer. For many African countries, this has been the story of our natural resources. The Democratic Republic of Congo has some of the world's richest deposits of cobalt. Yet, much of the processing happens somewhere else. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire produces most of the world's cocoa, but the biggest profits from the chocolate are made outside Africa. Nigeria has been one of the largest crude oil producers, yet for decades, it exported crude oil only to import refined petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel at much higher prices. This meant billions of dollars left the country every year. Foreign exchange was constantly under pressure. The country was producing oil but still depended on other nations for finished products. It was an economic contradiction. The Dangote refinery was designed to change that. Unlike many older refineries, it was built on a scale that could compete with the largest facilities anywhere in the world. With a refining capacity of around 650,000 barrels of crude oil per year, it's become one of the largest single-train refinery ever constructed. That number is difficult to imagine. Every single year, enough crude oil passes through the refinery to produce enough quantities of petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel. But building a refinery is one thing, running it successfully is another thing. For years, many people questioned whether the project would actually deliver. Some pointed to delays, others focused on rising construction costs. There were predictions that it would never operate at full capacity. Yet, over time, these doubts began to disappear. Productions increased, exports expanded, international buyers started paying attention. Then came the moment that changed everything. As uncertainty affected parts of the global oil markets, demand for reliable aviation fuel suppliers increased. Nigeria was no longer simply exporting crude, it was exporting refined fuel, and not in small quantities. Aircraft across different countries were increasingly powered by fuel refined in Lagos. For many Africans, this represented something bigger than oil. It represented confidence. Confidence that African countries can compete globally. Confidence that African engineers can build world-class infrastructure. Confidence that Africa does not always have to remain at the bottom of the value chain. It was a reminder that the continent possesses not only natural resources, but all the talent and ambition to transform them. And perhaps that is the refinery's greatest achievement. Not simply producing fuel, but changing what many Africans believe is impossible. Yet, even an international headline praised the refinery's success, another conversation was unfolding back home. Because when Nigerians were exporting more refined fuel than ever before, ordinary citizens continue asking a simple question: if we now refine our own oil, why is petrol so expensive? That question will soon become impossible to ignore. This is where this story becomes more complicated. If Nigeria is refining its own crude oil, if billions of naira that once left the country to pay for imported fuel are now being saved, if the country is exporting refined petroleum products to different parts of the world, then why hasn't life become easier for ordinary Nigerians? It is a fair question. For many families, fuel is not just another product, it affects almost everything. When petrol becomes more expensive, transportation costs rise. Food becomes more expensive because farmers and transport companies spend more on fuel. Small businesses that depend on generators spend more to keep their doors open. Manufacturers face higher production costs. Delivery services increase their prices. Even school fees, house rent, and market prices eventually feel the impact. Fuel is the engine behind almost every part of the economy. So when petrol prices remain high, millions of people fuel it every single day. Many Nigerians expected that once the country begins refining enough fuel, local prices will gradually become more affordable. After all, one of the biggest arguments for building a world-class refinery was to reduce dependence on imported fuel. And to some extent, that goal has not been achieved. Nigeria's petrol imports have fallen significantly compared to previous years. The amount of foreign exchange spent importing fuel has also reduced. These are important achievements, but achievements on paper do not always translate immediately into relief at the filling station. And that is where frustration begins. Many people assume that because the refinery is located in Nigeria, it should automatically sell fuel at low prices. Unfortunately, the economics of refining are not that simple. A refinery is still a business. It may buy crude oil, it must pay workers. It must maintain equipment. It must repay loans. It must transport products across the country. And like every private company, it must make enough profit to survive. This is where emotions often collide with economics. People naturally want cheaper fuel. Businesses naturally seek sustainable profits. Sometimes these interests align, sometimes they don't. But many analyses argue that the refinery alone cannot explain the prices Nigerians pay. To understand the full picture, we have to follow the journey of a single barrel of crude oil. Where does it come from? Who supplies it? What currency is used to buy it? How much does transportation cost? What tests and charges are added before it reaches to the consumer? Only after answering these questions can we begin to understand why fuel prices remain stubbornly high. And once these questions emerge, the spotlight begins to shift, because the debate is no longer just about one refinery. It becomes a conversation about government policy, oil supply, foreign exchange, taxes, infrastructure, and one of the complex systems that determines the final price every Nigerian sees at the pump. In other words, the story is much bigger than Dangote alone, and that is where our investigation takes us next. When petrol price rise, people naturally look for someone to blame. Some point to the refinery, others point to the government. But before reaching a conclusion, it is worth asking a simple question. How is the price of petrol actually determined? Many people assume that because Nigeria produces crude oil, local refineries receive that crude oil almost for free. This isn't how the industry works. Crude oil is a global commodity. Whether it is produced in Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, or the United States, it has an international market value. A private refinery must still buy it. And if that crude oil is purchased at international prices, the final product would always reflect international market realities. But there's another layer to this story. To help local refining, Nigeria introduced an arrangement that will allow domestic refineries to purchase crude oil in naira instead of sourcing large amounts of the US dollars. On paper, it was a smart idea. It will reduce pressure on foreign exchange, lower production costs, and hopefully make locally refined fuel more competitive. However, reports suggested that crude deliveries under this arrangement did not always meet expectations. When local supplies fell short, refiners had little choice but to source crude oil from international markets. That meant buying oil from countries such as Angola, Libya, or even the United States. And this purchase had to be made in dollars. Immediately, the cost of refining increased. But crude oil is only one part of the equation. There are shipping costs, production charges, pipeline expenses, storage fees, insurance, exchange rate fluctuations, distribution costs, and taxes. Each one may seem small in its own. Together, they can add a significant amount to the final price motorists pay. This is why experts often warn against looking for a single villain. The fuel market is shaped by an entire chain of decisions. A disruption of one point affects everything that follows. Then, there's another uncomfortable reality. When global crude oil prices rise, governments in oil-producing countries often get more revenue from the exports. Higher oil prices can increase national income, but for some consumers, those same higher prices usually mean more expensive petrol. So while government revenues may improve, households often feel greater financial pressure. It is a difficult balance. Governments need revenue to fund infrastructure, healthcare, education, and security. Citizens need affordable fuel to keep the economy moving. Finding a balance between these two priorities is one of the biggest economic challenges facing oil-producing nations. That is why the debate cannot simply be reduced to Dangote versus the government. Both play important roles. The refinery must operate as a profitable business. The government must create policies that make local refinery efficient and competitive. If either side fails, ordinary Nigerians are the ones who ultimately bear the cost. And yet, just as this debate intensified, another controversy emerged, one that left many Nigerians asking an even more surprising question. Could it actually be cheaper to import petrol than buy it from a refinery located inside Nigeria? At first glance, that sounds impossible. But reports sparked a national conversation, and once again, opinions were sharply divided. Just when many people thought they understood the story, another debate emerged. Reports began circulating that some petroleum products linked to the Dangote refinery were finding their way to neighboring countries before returning to Nigeria through traders. The claim immediately raised eyebrows. If true, it would mean that fuel refined in Nigeria was leaving the country, passing through regional trade hubs, and somehow becoming competitive again in the Nigerian markets. Many Nigerians asked the obvious question: how can fuel travel hundreds of kilometers across borders and still compete with fuel bought directly at home? Industry analysts pointed to shipping data and market trends. Some marketers argue that pricing differences within the regional markets can create opportunities for traders. Others insisted the numbers deserved closer investigation. The refinery, however, strongly rejected these allegations. Its management maintained that its contracts prohibit buyers from re-exporting products back into Nigeria. Today, fuel refined in one African country can supply airlines in another. Petroleum products can move across multiple borders before reaching the consumers. Regional trade is becoming more important, and that is exactly what the founders of the African Continental Free Trade Area envisioned. A continent where African countries increasingly trade with one another instead of depending almost entirely on markets outside Africa. Whether it is petroleum, manufactured goods, processed goods, or technology, the future of Africa would depend not only on producing more, but also on trading with ourselves. That is why this refinery matters far beyond Nigeria. It represents a shift in thinking. For generations, Africa exported raw materials and imported finished products. Now, one of the continent's largest economies is proving that value can also be created at home. Imagine if the same approach were applied elsewhere. What if cocoa from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire was produced into premium chocolates before export? What if cobalt for the Democratic Republic of Congo becomes finished batteries manufactured on African soil? What if African cotton becomes world-class clothing brands made in African factories? What if our lithium-powered electric vehicles assembled on the continent? The refinery is not just an oil story, it is a reminder of what industrialization can achieve. Processing raw material creates skilled jobs. It keeps more wealth within African economies. It strengthens local currencies by increasing exports with higher values. And it gives young Africans opportunities that simply do not exist when we export only raw resources. That is the bigger conversation. The refinery has shown what is possible. Now, the challenge is making sure that ordinary citizens experience the benefits in their daily lives. Because economic success should not only be measured by the export figures or impressive statistics, it should be measured by whether families can afford transportation, whether businesses can grow, whether factories can compete, and whether the average citizen can genuinely feel the impact of national progress. That is the true test of development. The story of the Dangote refinery is neither a fairy tale or a failure. It is a story that is being written. On one hand, it has achieved something many believed Africa could not achieve. It has demonstrated that a world-class industrial project can be built, operated, recognized on the global stage from African soil. That achievement deserves recognition. And on the other hand, success at the international level must eventually translate real improvement at home. Affordable energy, a stronger economy, more jobs. greater industrial growth, and a better quality of life for ordinary people. Those are the outcomes that matters the most. Perhaps the biggest lesson is this: Africa's future would not be transformed simply because we possess natural resources. It will be transformed when we process them, when we manufacture more, when we innovate, and when the wealth created reaches the people whose resources made it possible. The Dangote Refinery may not answer every question, but it has started an important conversation, not just for Nigeria, but for the entire continent. The question is now whether African governments, businesses, and citizens can work together to build on this momentum. Because if one refinery can change one global conversation, imagine what hundreds of world-class African industries could achieve. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to AfriArise, and turn on notifications so you will never miss out on our next deep dive into Africa's biggest stories. And now, we would like to hear from you. Do you believe projects like the Dangote Refinery will eventually improve the lives of ordinary Africans, or is more policy reform needed before the benefits can be truly enjoyed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep believing in Africans' potential. This is AfriArise. My name is Blessing Chris. See you in the next one.